I'm Faiz Shakir.
And I'm Amanda Litman. Our guest this week on Battleground is Danielle Butterfield, Executive Director of Priorities USA.
I was wondering, Danielle, if you had some thoughts on how Republicans spend. Any things that we can learn basically from this last cycle? It appears to me that they are better spenders on the digital platforms. Obviously, Trump got a lot of attention for YouTube purchases and a whole bunch of digital campaigning on his part, which was core to his strategy. Any observations and takeaways from Republican spending?
Yeah, a lot. So I think one of the things that Republicans do well is they have an easier time taking advantage of kind of what already exists on the internet. We talk a lot about how Republican content is divisive and the algorithm eats it up. The content that they run often gets cheaper rates because it gets shared more often. Does that make them good at digital? I think some would argue yes. I would argue like they just have a structural advantage.
Well, they built a whole like ecosystem. I mean, if you look at, from Ben Shapiro's stuff to
Sure.
PragerU to, Fox News Online. I mean, they're very powerful forces on Facebook, YouTube, and therefore you've really kind of built audience already. So when you spend, you're reaching in a magnified way in ways that the left, I don't think, has corollaries to the impact influence of those kinds of outlets.
Sure. And that, like, they 100% have an advantage when it comes to earned media and the infrastructure that they have built up over the last several years. The internet and the way advertising works online is set up to benefit corporate advertisers that are trying to sell you products. And so anytime you're an advertiser coming in that's going to try to get you to click on something and buy something and put something in your cart, there's going to be a ton of advertising products out there that help you do that. And I think when it comes to like persuasion-oriented advertising, where you're really trying to change someone's mind or get them to think about a new idea, that will be, we consider that branding advertising in the corporate world. There is less room to do that well in our current advertising ecosystem. And frankly, that's going to get even harder when the privacy changes roll out. It's really hard to measure whether or not an ad you're running is changing someone's mind. Trump's campaign and Republicans, they used conversion-based advertising to grow their base and to use a lot of look-like modeling and targeting and get people to buy MAGA hats. I think they just had a very different approach than we have traditionally had in the past. I wouldn't necessarily call it better or worse.
What's your take, Danielle? What happened in this last election cycle? Why didn't Democrats have the kind of gigantic blue wave that many people were hoping and some expecting? Donald Trump, so hated, he will not do well, and yet he gains votes. Would you agree that Republicans overperformed the expectations?
Yes, they overperformed. They obviously ran a robust mobilization program. I would say the number one issue that we have is that our perception of what it means to be a persuasion target is off on the Democratic side. We assume that persuasion targets live in the suburbs and they're all middle-aged white ladies, and that is just not the case. The hardest program that we had to fundraise for last cycle was our Black persuasion program. We couldn't get donors to believe that we had a problem when it came to Black voters and that they needed to be persuaded and not just sent a look up your polling place ad in the last 2 weeks of the election. Like we needed to convince them that Biden was going to fight for them and that Trump was dangerous. And I think one of the programs that we are running at Priorities in 2022 is what we're calling our new Biden voter program. It's the people that showed up for the first time in 2020, and we're treating them as a retention audience. We're treating them as people that they're new customers, and we need to get them to show up again and become repeat customers. It's a pretty simple marketing challenge. That's why I'm really excited about it, because I think anytime we can kind of compare ourselves to a corporate advertiser, there's always going to be more tools in our toolbox in order to be successful.
But another way of saying what you just stated, which is kind of the more mind-blowing element, is Donald Trump is doing better with Black people than we think. Donald Trump is performing better with these audience than we're giving credit for. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%.
But I think, why is that? Do we know?
I mean, I think it's because we go in with assumptions about these audiences without fully understanding what they care about. Like, we go in and assume that just because you're a Black voter that all of a sudden your number one issue is going to be criminal justice, whereas like Black people care about the economy just as much as other voters do. We don't spend enough time actually like investigating people of color like we do white voters. We do polls all the time where we over-index on college-educated white women under 30. We don't spend that much time investigating the nuance of how Black voters or Latino voters separate themselves. Like, we need to be doing as much segmentation amongst people of color as we do amongst white people. I think it's a research problem.
You have name-checked a couple different kinds of advertising programs, and I want to just make sure we're defining the terms for folks who might not be in the weeds here. You've name-checked fundraising programs, mobilization programs, persuasion programs. Can you articulate the difference and what that might look like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So I think, to me, there's advertising usually breaks down into two different types of goals. There's either an action that's being taken or a non-action that's being taken. I'd say action-oriented campaigns are where you're asking someone to do something. You're asking them to call a member of Congress, sign up for a petition, make a donation. Those are conversion-based ad campaigns. And then you have like more kind of non-conversion-based awareness campaigns where really ultimately you're trying to get someone to change their mind, think about a new issue. And so the way that those campaigns break down in politics, I would say, like, persuasion is often trying to get someone, like I said, to think about a new issue, to think about something in a certain way. Mobilization, you're trying to get someone to turn out and vote. That persuasion mindset, I think, is a really important one, because we often think about persuasion as, I even said it myself, getting someone to change their mind. The reality of someone coming in and like flip-flopping day to day or being undecided in an election is actually probably less common than you would think. But I think the goal is, if we can get someone to wake up in the morning on the election and have the number one thing in the top of their mind be healthcare costs, we know Democrats are going to do better. But if they wake up in the morning and are thinking about other things, we're going to do worse. And so our job is to make the issues where people align with us more salient in the election. And that, as like a persuasion mindset, I think is a really helpful one to kind of ground how we're strategizing.
So if I heard you correctly, why Republicans and Trump overperformed, right, in this last cycle? That's the question I want to try to drive at.
We assume that persuasion targets live in the suburbs and they're all middle-aged white ladies, and that is just
a little
not
bit of
the case.
a research on people of color and appeal of where he was, I guess, overperforming. Anything else to say about why Republicans overperformed, putting aside the gerrymandering problem, obviously, but I'm just curious, honestly, from your perspective, what happens there? Why are they winning new voters, persuading more voters? What's growing there for them?
I think my number one answer to this question is just that the media landscape advantage that they have is I don't want to say insurmountable, but it is certainly one of our biggest challenges. The singular force that they have communicating fake news and disinformation to their voters that we have to overcome is really, really, it scares me a lot.
Butterfield, do you think persuasion, particularly of people who voted for Trump or voted for Republicans for the last two cycles, is even possible?
Yes, I do think it's possible, because I think the way we think about persuasion needs to adjust. Because I think right now, like, a persuasion program that we are running is boosting credible news headlines to people that are watching Fox on a daily basis. Like, that is persuasion, right? That is like supplementing someone's news diet with credible information so that they can be receptible to a stronger argument down the line. And I think, like, it's starting from a different standpoint, but I think it's important and it is doable to get people to think differently. I think that we're just up against a really tough battle because of the news source advantage that they have.
Thanks for watching. You can get the full episode of Battleground on the Recount, streaming daily, or listen to it wherever you get your podcasts.